With all the expensive deluxified board games that are launching these days, what is it that makes us happy to shell out hundreds of dollars on a single game and all its expansions? Or conversely, what makes us upset at the pricing when we feel like a company's just asking for a little bit too much? Every once in a while, there's a campaign that pops up that causes a stir in the community, and there's a lot of talk back and forth with people on both sides, with some thinking the price is justified, while others thinking that it's completely insane. And throughout all this, I've seen a ton of points brought up on both sides. Some of them I agree with, and some of them I very much don't agree with. And many of us are very opinionated and very confident in our opinions as well, and I feel like I do fall into that category. But it's also natural to find all this noise just a little bit confusing, especially when our hopes and emotions tied with a particular game are challenged by what we're willing to pay. I wanted to make this video to clear up some of that confusion, but then also possibly bring some common ground to those of us that aren't exactly seeing eye to eye. This is very nuanced, and I don't think I'd be able to get through this on my own, so I'm going to be busting out the big guns here because I spent some time to put together some diagrams and some slides to give you a high quality PowerPoint presentation. The first thing I want to go over here is just a few definitions because I'm going to be referring back to these throughout the entirety of this video. And I just want to make sure that we all understand the difference between a few terms that are often used interchangeably. First, we have the price, which is just what is the seller asking for that item. But then we have the value, and this is something that I want to be really clear on because the value is not associated with the price in any way, shape, or form. The value of a product is just what you perceive it to be. And there's a bunch of factors that could play into this when you're talking about a board game, like is it a theme that you like? Does it have mechanisms that you like? Do you like the design? Or even what is the resale value of this product if you decide that it's no longer for you? And there are other things that aren't related to the specific item you're buying that could add or subtract from the value. I do own and operate my own company, and we do sell a product, but a better way to look at it is that the entire company is the product, and the entire company is going to give your clients some sort of experience when they're dealing with you or buying the product that you sell. So when I see a bad review on Board Game Geek because a company did something that people didn't like, I personally don't have a problem if that impacts their rating one way or another, because like I said, the entire company should be viewed as a product, and the way that they choose to operate is going to impact your overall experience. I understand why some people don't agree with that because whatever a designer or a publisher has done in the past isn't going to change the way that that game plays. But if you feel that way, it's probably because you just put more value on the game and the design. You don't really care what goes on around it, whereas other people do. So I think we can already see here that there's a lot of nuance when it comes to defining value, and we're not all going to see eye to eye. But I think that is also something that we can agree on, that just because I value something a certain way, it doesn't mean that anyone else is going to be valuing it that same way, and other people might value something wildly differently from you for reasons that you might not even know about or even fully understand. But the last term I want to go over here is the cost, and this sounds like a pretty basic term, but I think this one is really important to understand, and it's just basically your total amount of resources that you had to invest in order to get this product. And this normally does include the price, but you also have to account for shipping as well as any tax that you might have to pay, and there's also other costs that may not be monetary, like the time that you spent reviewing it or watching this video. And then there is also the time value of money, which is a very real thing when it comes to buying these board games off these campaigns that don't deliver over a period of years, because you're paying your money up front right now and then you're waiting a long time without getting anything in return. And I think this is a cost that's often overlooked, because if you didn't buy this expensive board game, you could be investing that money and getting a percentage of that back in return, or you could also be paying off a debt that might have a high interest on it. Over a period of years, that could actually make you or save you quite a bit of cash. And believe me, it is a huge benefit of these companies that are launching these Kickstarters to get their money up front, because it means that they don't have to take on any debt in order to manufacture their product. And anything that they don't need to spend right away, they could actually invest and make a pretty nice profit. And because cost is the more important factor here opposed to price, it is what I tend to look at when I'm deciding my purchases, and I would urge you to do the same. It's also what I'm going to be referencing throughout this video. But now I want to jump back to value, because I did say it's really difficult to define and everyone does have their own interpretation of it. But one thing I think I can do is go over a few things that don't add to value. And these are things that I have seen oftentimes being associated with value, and I just don't think that they add to value in any way, and I'll go through each of them and explain why. But some of these may be a little bit different if you're looking at them from an individual versus the entire buyer pool, because like I said, some things might add value to an individual, but you can't put that same expectation on everyone else. And the first thing I want to go over that doesn't add to the value of a product is that product's cost of production. I've seen this one come up a lot, especially in various comments where people are trying to use the cost of its production in order to justify its price. And yes, as a company, you do want your price to be higher than your costs because then you're making a profit. And if you're not doing that, well, it's just bad business. And this is why a lot of companies do fail, because the majority of people just don't value their product enough to pay the price that they're asking for. And that's just a harsh truth, because in no way should the buyer be expected to pay more than they're willing to just because a company has higher costs. For example, if I'm selling you a miniature for $10 and you value that miniature at $10 but only cost me $5 to manufacture, that's great. You got something that's priced at what you value, and I got to make a profit of $5. That's mutually beneficial. But if my costs double and I'm now paying $10 for a miniature, does it magically change the value that you put on it? No. I could try to price it at $20 to try and get the same margin that I got before, but that doesn't change the fact that you still value it at $10, so it doesn't make any sense for you to buy it. And this is something that I see from a lot of companies that know that they're charging a lot for their product. For example, Splotter just goes ahead and says this rate on their website, and I don't have a problem with them doing this, explaining why they need to charge as much as they do. And the exact same thing happened here with Food Chain Magnate, where they're saying that their prices are in line with their manufacturing costs. That may be true. I don't know. I'm not able to peek behind the curtains and see exactly what all of these cost. When your prices get so high compared to other people that are able to do the same thing for much cheaper, I do start to get skeptical. But whether it's true or not doesn't really matter, because the cost is the cost and it's my only option. So I just need to ask myself, do I value it enough to pay that cost? And if you let your production costs get so unreasonably high, more and more people are going to say no to that. And a good company would want to keep their costs down as much as possible so that they can offer a better price that is well within what people value that product for. And yes, this video was inspired by the Food Chain Magnate campaign and its new deluxe edition, and that is helpful for me to explain now because it's going to be relevant for my next point. That's when people try to justify the price by using the price of the alternatives. I think this is wrong for a bunch of different reasons. There's a few different cases that this comes up. In this case, this is a deluxe edition, so you can always compare this price to the original price. But like I said, with the original game, even Splotter says that's overpriced and expensive. So you're comparing something to something that is expensive. And the only thing you're going to get out of comparing them is just the difference between their costs. It doesn't actually mean anything. The value that someone puts on the original game could be completely different than what they put on this deluxe edition. This is offering a completely different value proposition than what this game is offering. Even though they have the same core design and mechanisms, these are still very different products. And that's why I also just don't accept when people say, if you don't like the price on this new version, just go buy the original. Because if those people didn't already buy the original, it's because it doesn't provide a value proposition that they are interested in. For any of us that were considering that, or maybe even did do that, I think you want to ask yourself if you would have done it if this campaign never existed. If the original game didn't offer you the value that it needed to justify its price, that fact doesn't change just because there's a new version of it. And if this one doesn't offer the value to justify its price, well, now there's just two versions that don't have value propositions that make sense to you, which is understandable to be upset about, especially if this is a game that you wanted to experience. I never bought this because the price doesn't justify the value to me, and I was really excited to hear that there would be a new value proposition to consider, and I was hoping it would be at a more reasonable price, since this one should have quantities of scale and it is being published by a company that has a lot of experience in the industry. So I was hoping that they could offer it for about the same price, but offer more value with things that matter to me, like the overall look of the game and putting just a little bit more effort into the components. And although they did do that, they also just happened to increase the price way beyond what those changes added to the value for me. And I feel like my disappointment is perfectly justified. And the third point that does not add to the value of a game is its BGG ranking. And this one has a little bit more nuance, and it is a little bit different if you're looking at it from an individual level versus as a more general statement. Because if the design is just one of your favorite games and it's one that you really love and you would personally rank it up in the top 100, then of course that does add more value to you. But board games are subjective, and just because something is in the top 100 or even in the top 50, it doesn't mean that it's going to be in the top 50 for you. And this is why I always recommend that people try these games before they buy them if they're able to, because there are just a ton of games on here that I've played that I don't even want to play a second time. You could argue that a game being on the top 100 does add to its resale value, which would increase the value of the game, since having a safety net in case you don't like it is valuable. But I just really don't like this argument that you should be paying more for a good design, because any good designer or any good publisher should be trying to make well-designed games. That's just a fundamental of making board games. And this part is just more my opinion, but I think a good designer or a good publisher should just want to design good games. And a good designer and a good publisher should want to offer them as low cost as possible so that as many people can experience it. Codenames is one of my favorite board games of all time, and it's just a bunch of cards, which is really simple to manufacture, but I think it's a design masterpiece because it just creates an experience that's really fun. Anyone can just jump into it and get going, and you have a very different game every time you play. It's also an amazing social experience, and if that game was being sold for like $100, I'd probably still buy it because it's worth that much to me. But that's a $10 game, and I think the reason for that is because the publisher and designer just wants as many people to experience that game as possible, and they're happy with the margins that they have. But this next point is a really interesting one, and I think it's probably affected almost every single one of us, especially after we've purchased the game, but this is something that will affect you throughout the entire process of buying and owning a game. And that's that the price of the product itself in some way adds to its value, and that's just simply not true. Sometimes the price can be an indicator of quality, but when we're looking at board games that cost as much as these games do, that should just be pretty much a base expectation. But outside of the quality implications, I think this also comes into play in two other ways. One of which I think does apply to this specific campaign with Food Chain Magnate, and another way that I think doesn't really apply to this campaign. And I'll start with the one that doesn't apply, and that's that a lot of these campaigns do have prices on them that are often slashed out, like you can see here. This one does make sense because they're showing you the savings of buying the all-in opposed to if you were to buy them separate on this campaign. So they're just telling you how much you're saving by doing that. That's fine here, but I still want to mention it because it does show up on a lot of other campaigns, and that's when they show a price even just for the base game and then show it crossed out and then offer you a lower price. And the problem with this is that both the price and the crossed out price are just completely two made up numbers. They set the price and then they just pick some other price in order to cross out to make it look like you're getting some massive savings when it's just not really true. This is just a tactic used to make you feel like you're getting a good deal. And if we just go back to one of our previous points that the price of the alternative shouldn't impact your value of that item, that same thing applies here. The only thing you should be concerned about is what do you value it and what is the price that they're currently asking. So that's the part that I said doesn't apply for this specific campaign. So what is the part that does? And this comes back to what I have written here, and that's the sunk cost fallacy. Because when we spend a lot of money on a game, say for the original Food Chain Magnate, we all don't want to feel like we made a bad purchase after spending all that money. So there's this natural bias that we have when we purchase expensive things that kind of causes us to put on rose-colored glasses and not see the faults as much as we would have otherwise. I'm not going to claim that this is in the top 100 because of that, because I don't think that's true, but I definitely think it helps. The sunk cost fallacy and the bias that it brings is a real thing, so it definitely plays a part, especially when Food Chain Magnate is an expensive game. But this can happen with any product, and it does, including other board games, and I often question if that is coming into play with some of the games that I've played that a lot of other people loved. But I'm not going to point any fingers here, I'm not petty like that. But my last point here that shouldn't be a factor when you're trying to evaluate the value of a product is your own individual wealth. There were a lot of comments for Food Chain Magnate of people unhappy with the price, and there is a lot of other comments coming back at them saying, stop whining, it was an easy back for me. People's financial situations are different, and if you have a lot of money, 300 euros might not seem like very much to you. And I would still argue that a person's individual value of a product doesn't change depending on how much money they have, because if I just came upon $1 million tomorrow, the value of Food Chain Magnate hasn't changed for me. The only thing that's changed is the amount of money I have, which means that I put less value on keeping $300. So really the value of the products isn't changing to you, it's your value of money. I don't think this one affects us quite as much as the other points I have on this list, but I did want to keep it on here just because it does affect how we treat each other, and we do need to understand that we're not all in the same financial situation, and there is a difference with how much value we put on the money that we're willing to give away. And with that said, I think it's awesome to give feedback and let publishers know when you do have an issue with their pricing, or if you don't feel like they're giving a proper value proposition. There are a lot of companies out there that are just trying to squeeze as much out of their customers as possible, but there's also a lot of good companies out there as well that maybe just need a bit of feedback and might have just made a couple mistakes when it comes to what they're offering and at what price. So I might have dug a little deeper into that than I originally intended, but I do just want to go over one last thing before we wrap up this video, and that's to answer the question, when is it justified to be upset or angry with the pricing of a product? And I probably don't need to pick on Food Chain Magnate any more than I already have, but I am going to be using them as an example here, and I am going to be using their pricing and the value that I perceive their product to be. So this simple little chart here is the cost of the retail Food Chain Magnate. It's about $100 for the base game and about another $100 if you want to get the extra expansion. But let's go ahead and apply what I perceive the value of that game to be. And just to be clear, I haven't bought this game because the value I perceive it to be is below what they are asking. So when I see that on a store shelf, I just walk right by, because to me it's about a $60 game, and that's about the most that I would pay for it even on the secondhand market. And when it comes to the expansion, I'm even less interested in that because it's just way too much to invest in this game as a whole to get the expansion, which is another $100 in retail. If I found both of them together on the secondhand market, I'd probably only spend like $100 or maybe $120 on that. I don't have an issue with the game. I don't mind the bad production or the bad artwork, but for what it is offering, that's only worth about $60 for me. I mean, the game seems fine. I don't think I'm going to like it way more than any other game in my collection, and it's also a long game to play, and that combined with the very poor artwork and production, I think it's going to make it very difficult to table and to convince other people to want to jump in on. And it's for that reason that I value it for what I do, and unfortunately that's way below what they're asking, so that's why I've never bought this game. A new edition coming out doesn't change this logic for me, but it does create another opportunity and another option for me to purchase the game if my value of that version is above what they are asking in cost. I kept the values of the previous chart on this chart as well just for fun, but I just grayed them out for reference. But this red line here is now showing you the costs of the collector's edition of the Food Chain Magnate. And same thing here, I have the base game and the expansion, and I put the full cost here, which is just the shipping and the price that they're asking. I'm not considering the time value of money or anything like that. I just want to keep it simple. But for me, it would cost about $200 US. If I were to go in on the full pledge, that would cost me about $358. But does all the new additions and improvements add enough value for me to want to pay that price? Well, not even close, because the base game is only worth about $100 to me, and I know that's pretty much what the retail edition costs, but like I said, the retail was only worth about $60 to me, so that does make sense, and like I said before, you can't really compare two different offerings because they are two unique value propositions. What's interesting here is I am willing to pay more for the expansion than I was for the retail counterpart, and the whole reason for that is just because of the resale value with this, and the fact that I won't be able to get the expansion later if it turns out that I do want to buy it. Those two things do add value to the purchase for me, so with all that considered, I'm willing to pay about $250 for the entire thing. Fortunately for me and the publisher, that's way below what they are asking, so I do not plan to back either of these versions of the game, which means that they're not getting my business and I'm also an unhappy customer. But now that raises the question of how unhappy am I justified to be? And I think that depends on a few factors, but one of those factors is just how big is the discrepancy between what I'm willing to pay and what the actual cost is. In this case, it's over $100, which is over a third of what I was willing to pay, which just makes me feel like this is so far out of reach and like the company just doesn't care about what I want or my needs, and I'm a pretty tough guy here, so it doesn't really bother me that much, but it does incite those feelings, and the further you get out of touch with your customer base, the worse that this is going to be. But I think a better way to evaluate this is to look at the market as a whole and look at your entire customer base, because if more people are feeling the same way, then that's just going to amplify that feeling, and it's also going to make it feel more justified. And anytime you want to look at data this way, one of the best ways to do it is with a binomial distribution. And all this is a chart, also known as a bell curve, where the chart in this case represents the distribution of people that put a certain amount of value on a product, in this case, food chain magnate. And this isn't based on real data. This is just my crude estimation of what I think this distribution would look like, where we have most of the people in the middle of the chart. Of course, as we increase in value, there's going to be less and less people that perceive it to be worth that much. This is also true in the opposite direction, where if you ask me if this was worth $80, I would say, no, it's definitely worth more than that. But there are still people that would only put $80 worth of value on this based on what they value. And one thing to note here is that this doesn't really ever go to zero. No matter how far you go back, you're still going to find people that you can pay to take this game. But let's go ahead and slap on that same cost that I was using in the previous charts. So this is the cost for the all-in pledge, including the shipping to my location, because that's just what I used. And like I said, this is just a crude estimation, but I think the story this tells would be very accurate even if we did have real data here, because what we're seeing here is that the cost is only allowing for this top few percentile to be able to actually value the game at what they are charging for it. This means that the majority of people that would otherwise be interested in buying the game are just not able to do it because you're just asking way more than they're willing to pay. Only a small percentage of these people are actually going to voice their concerns, but the bigger and bigger you make this pool of people, the louder that's going to be. Like I said before, I think a good company should try to make their experience as accessible to as many people as possible. So really you want this line to be as far to the left as you can. From a business perspective, there is also some sort of profit optimization you can do here to try and maximize the amount of money that you'll make, because probably being at the very bottom and probably being at the very top is not the best business decision. It's usually somewhere around here that you'll find that optimal point. And that's great because usually selling and manufacturing more product does increase the company's margins with quantities of scale. It's also one of those few things that benefits the company as well as the customers, because the company gets to sell more product and hopefully make more money. But then the customers are also getting a better price, meaning that more of them are able to purchase it. But not only did Lucky Duck and Splotter go in the complete opposite direction with this, offering it only to a small few people that value it that much, but they also asked for it at such an exorbitant price that when you compare it to other campaigns offering a similar product or even much more for a much less price, that really makes you question if their manufacturing costs there are truly as bad as they say. And since that was the reason that they used to try and justify their price, any dishonesty there is definitely going to make people upset. Like I said before, we can't look behind the curtains, so we don't really know, but it doesn't look great when I see these other campaigns offering so much more for such a better price. And having so many of us question this, whether it's true or not, is just not something a company wants on their reputation. And that's just another business case for these companies to offer reasonable prices that make their customers feel respected. So yes, I do feel like the anger and disdain towards this campaign was justified, because a company should just do better for their own sake and their customers. And I already did say a few times that I do think it's important for us to voice our concerns and to let the company know in whatever form that is, because the good companies will listen. And that is exactly what Lucky Duck did here, and I am super impressed with what they were able to come up with, because I'll be honest, I nearly completely lost hope for this campaign. After seeing those initial prices and how far that was off from what I was willing to pay, I didn't think they were going to come back with anything much better. It would have been a lot better if they started the campaign with something like this, because when you have a distribution like this, you've already burned a lot of goodwill with your potential customers. And if you're able to anticipate this, this should immediately throw red flags that maybe you should come up with a different product offering. They did get there in the end, and this looks awesome to me, but like I said before, it's better to look at your customer base as a whole. So let's just go ahead for fun and plug these numbers into those charts that I just walked through. This is what it looks like when I add the deluxe edition to my own personal chart that charts the value to me. And as you can see, we do have a straight line here because they have condensed both the expansion and the core game into a single box, which does save on their costs. That's a compromise that makes sense, but for that reason, it's just a straight line here since you have no option to buy the base game. But if we look on the right hand side of the chart, the cost is now dipped below the value that I think the base and the expansion are worth to me. And this is where the StretchPay turns into a very powerful tool for backers, because if the cost of this is below the value that you perceive it to be, then StretchPay becomes a fantastic tool that lets you keep your money a little bit longer. And like I said before, there is a concept of the time value of money, and it also allows you to budget a little bit better so you don't have such a big cost all at once. This means that I am willing to purchase the game, and there's only one more factor to consider, and that's whether or not I can afford it. If you can't afford this game, or if the cost is still greater than the value that it brings to you, StretchPay is not going to change that. Even though a lot of these campaigns have just been advertising the cost of a single payment, don't let that cause you to make bad financial decisions. And if we look back at my crude distribution chart, we can see how far that line has now moved to the left, now making this game worth it for anyone who's on this side of the chart. Like I said, this is just an estimate, so it could be even further to the left depending on how people value this game. But you can pretty much look at this chart like having all the happy backers here on the right hand side, and with this line moved to where it is, the scales have definitely been tipped in that favor, so that just means that we'll have a lot more people experiencing this game, and a lot more people who will be happy that they are able to. And for any of you out there that are planning to run a campaign in the future, please learn from this, and I'll just leave you with one final diagram, and this is a Venn diagram that I like to call the happy backer diagram. At the top we have the people who want to experience your game, on the left we have the people that can afford it, and then on the right hand side we have the people whose perceived value of your game is greater than the cost that you're asking. At the start of this campaign, I think most people were in these two segments here where they wanted to experience the game, but they couldn't afford it, and they simultaneously felt like the cost of it was just way above the value that it was offering. Or they were in this section where they could afford it, but just still felt like it was more than they were willing to pay. Maybe there's a small portion of people that wanted to experience it and did think the price was worth it, but they just couldn't afford it. But then we have the place where we all want to be, the happy backers here in the middle, the people who want to experience the game, can afford it, and feel like the cost that you're asking is within the value that we put on it. Take a screenshot, hang this up in your meeting room, I don't know, just try to make that happy backer section as big as possible with any campaigns that you run in the future. I hope this video was helpful, or at least somewhat entertaining, and if you did get value out of it, I do all of this for free, so if you want to show your support, I do have some ways that you can support me in the description below, both one-time donations or ongoing memberships, so feel free to check that out. I don't normally put out videos like this, so feel free to share it if you think you know anyone that might find this information helpful. It's quite a bit different than my usual content, so I don't know how YouTube's going to try to promote it, so if you could help me out in any way there, that would be awesome. But either way, I do appreciate you checking out the video, and until next time, keep that shelf cluttered and the table full.